All right, folks, welcome to our panel. The panel is called Shifting Identities, Making Communities, Lessons on Politics, Participation, and City Making. My name is Gautam Bhan. I teach here at IIHS, and I'll be chairing the session. We have 5 papers in this, and I'm going to get straight to it so that we have as much time in the end for Q&A as possible. Our first paper is online by Radhika Chander from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Radhika, can I invite you to start?
Hello, hi, thank you for this. Really looking forward to the other presentations as well. So my paper is titled Caste as an Urban Problem, Chennai River Restoration, Slum Evictions and Resettlement and Vote Bank Politics. My research is essentially what the title says. So I'm just going to get into it by looking first at examples, and then I'll just bring in my analysis whenever it's appropriate. And if there's time, then I can get into my literature. So the particular slum that I'm looking at in Chennai is called Govindasamy Nagar. It's on Elango Street. It is along the Buckingham Canal. The Buckingham Canal is a man-made canal made by the British in the 19th century. And this canal was used by them for transportation and trade. And then it was polluted, and the elites and the British started to move away from the canal and other rivers, which they tried to clean up, but then it wasn't working, so they moved away. And these areas were abandoned, so which is when the urban poor and started, setting up slums along these rivers. So important point to note here is that these rivers were already polluted, and that kind of dictated the choice of the slums to, be set up there. So this particular slum of Govindasamy Nagar has been there for over 60 years now. And if you've occupied, the government policy is that if you've occupied government land for over 10 years, then you become eligible to own a land deed for that land. But a lot of people in these slums, as they told me in my interactions with them, either don't have land deeds or they have it and it's just not acceptable for some reason. And whenever they've tried to acquire it, they've been treated poorly in these in these offices, or they've been caught up in a lot of bureaucratic paperwork, and they just never really had that solid, secure kind of ownership over that land. So this forms one layer of their precarity in their association with this land. Another thing is historically, so now they have concrete houses here, right? But earlier they lived in thatched roof houses, and they were constantly being set fire to. And they don't know who was setting fire to these slums earlier. So this has historically been there. This kind of forms their relationship to the land, again, very precariously. There's that sense of impermanence and an insecure home, which could be, they could be moved away at any point, and there's no permanent deed to connect them to the land. So this forms their connection to the land in general. This is the context that they live in. Now, with environmentalism, so the Chennai River Restoration Trust has been there since the early 2000s now, and it's set up. And after the floods of 2015, which were very devastating, there's more of a case for evictions in a sense, because it inundates these areas and there's problems of disease now after COVID. So the case for evictions is strong now. And however, it's not simply these cases that play over here. It's related to a legal case. So in 2004, the owner of an apartment complex right beside the slum filed a case against them, saying they were encroaching on his land. This didn't hold any sway legally because it was not true. And so about 10 years later, he filed a public interest litigation saying that they were encroaching upon the canal land. So the policy states that if you live within 40 meters of a water body, then you are an encroacher of that water body. So in 2015, about 350 families were removed from the 40-meter radius. But this logic is still held now in 2022 when the eviction drive was happening. It was still an environmental reason. They were still using the proximity to the canal as a reason for evicting them. So this was an important kind of question for me to approach this problem with. So I asked the Chennai River Restoration Trust official how this could still be used because they were already evicted. What he told me was that the width of the river is never the same along the city. So in some areas it's wider, and in some places it's shorter than it actually is. So the 40 meters might actually include the river itself. So it might have to be 40 meters beyond that. But there was no real proof or documentation that he showed me. I just took him for his word. And what's interesting is that on the other side of Govindasamy Nagar there are all these concrete houses, clearly affluent people who live there. There are temples, and the railway bridge itself runs along the canal. So the river bed is where the pillar of the railway bridge is embedded. So these establishments are under no, immediate threat of eviction, and there's no talk about it. So here you can see how the legal case and these environmental reasons and the disease reason and all of this history of their impermanence is used as a case to make evictions easier. So if you look at the root of it, and this is reflected in some of the language of the Chennai River restoration itself. It's really about the association of impurity with the slum dwellers that makes the real case for evictions, and all of these other reasons are just used to kind of support this idea that exists in the city. When I asked him what his vision was, what the River Restoration Trust's vision was for these riverside areas, what he told me was, we want sacred institutions like temples and schools to be near rivers and not slums and dirt. Now it's being used by many antisocial elements. It is full of garbage and stench. This is why the people of Chennai do not care about the rivers. We should make the river sacred and beautiful so people think of it as their river. Immediately over here, it's evident that when he says people of the city, he's already othering the slum dwellers. So on 9th May 2022, this was when the eviction drive was happening. A man called Kannayan, who belongs to the Communist Party of India, he lives in the slum. He's a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. He set fire to himself to protest the evictions. This halted the evictions for a while, and it kind of started off a series of protests and political drama, as it were. So his death, what's also important here is the caste of the people of this village, of this slum, and Kannayan himself. They belong to the 1-year caste. So there's a statewide 1-year caste political party called Patali Makkal Katchi, or PMK, in Tamil Nadu. And they kind of came in and appropriated his death, even though he belongs to a different political party, which is not even in the same coalition currently in the state. So if you look at all the posters that were put up of his death and his own corpse, it was branded with PMK's flag, PMK's symbols and colors. His corpse, he had a shawl which had the PMK colors on it. So they actually took it and rebranded it to turn this slum into a potential future vote bank. This is important because historically, slum improvement in Tamil Nadu has been a very highly politicized issue. It's used as a way to kind of get votes from slum dwellers. And this is not to say that they are victims of a vote bank politicization, but also that this is important for them because this is their only claims to the rights to this land. This is the only way that they have political representation. This is the only way they can counter the precarity that forms the context of their relationship with this land. After the protests for 2-3 days, there were a lot of political leaders who came here. Nobody from the incumbent party of the constituency, but all the other parties came, used the media presence there, and it eventually reached the chief minister, who did say that the evictions would either be stopped or that they would not be moved to the peripheries. So the ultimate agenda here for the slum dwellers is to not be moved to the peripheries. And I'll get into why that is later. So all the protests were really in vain because ultimately there was a ruling from the Supreme Court, despite the chief minister saying that they will not be moved away from the city. that they will be moved there, and that because this is an established practice, there's no real objection to it. So why do people not want to move to the peripheries, right? We've looked at, there are reasons like employment, and there shouldn't really have to be a reason why people don't want to move there. But it was interesting for me to see the extent to which they were protesting it. So it became an important question for me. Even though they've lived here for 60 years, that should form reason enough for them not to have to move away from their home. But it was interesting to see why they did not want to live in these particular resettlement sites, which are high density places, high rise, high density, and away from the city. However, if anyone knows Chennai, it's on the old Mahabalipuram road, which is fast urbanizing, and there's a lot of industry and private settlements there as well. So there is employment opportunity now. There is still an oversupply of labor, so their wages are lower and they're not treated well. But what's more interesting was in my conversation with people who live in these resettlement sites, what kept coming up was that we're made to live with people from other slums. This is where the perception of the city, of slum dwellers kind of comes in, because you can see that it's something that is internalized by slum dwellers themselves, because they are people of the city, contrary to what the Chennai River Restoration Trust believes. They too believe that other slums are associated with that impurity, criminality, illegality that is imposed on them. Now, when you put them into the same bracket, it makes them uncomfortable. And when they're put into these places, you don't allow them to exclude. And I thought that this was one way that it can be the manifestation of caste in cities is never usually read, but it is something that's real, in that the entire city is allowed to exclude, is allowed to own private property, and is allowed to practice its own casteism in forming its space and community. But the urban poor and the slum dwellers do not have that privilege. And yeah, that's how I concluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika, also for your timeliness. So as chair, I'm just going to leave one question for each of the panelists that you can begin the Q&A with just on place. So Radhika, I think it's a really interesting story to introduce the idea of impurity and illegality as joint dialectics, right? Because I think in the question of slum evictions and displacement, we know the slash between the illegal and the informal. And I think it's very interesting to think about the impure, the illegal, and the informal in this way. And I just wanted you in the Q&A to pick up 2 points, maybe to say more. One on them is what the nature of this slash is. So how does illegality add to impurity? Does it change it? Does it nuance it? Because they're two slightly different accusations, right? They're both moral accusations. They're both social accusations, but they're slightly different accusations. So just to think a little bit about that slash between impurity and illegality. And the second thing, to say a little bit more about the way in which what you're calling identity is being produced, because there's two distinct narratives here. Right? There's the self-assertion of a community on their caste, and then there's the construction of identity by a political party. And a political party who is not currently in the state. So just to think a bit more about political parties as urban actors, so that the notion of caste here is not just about the caste of the community, it's the caste of the community as mediated through the political party. And you use the word appropriation. I wonder if there's other ways also to think about this construction, right? Because all identity is always in dialogue and in relationship, right? What I call myself versus what you call me. And just to think about that dialogue a little bit. So thank you very much for those. I saw someone raise their hand on Zoom, just to remind folks of protocol. Questions go in the Q&A box, and we'll take them all together, other than questions of the chair. Wonderful. So we move on back to IRL, Jennifer Spencer from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai.
And talk about how I see participation operating in a flux through dynamic networks and changing policies. So the two policies that I looked at were Advanced Locality Management, or ALM, and the Swachh Mumbai Prabodhan Abhiyan. both operating within the limits of the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai or the Mumbai Municipal Corporation. And this was part of my qualitative study as a part of my MPhil research. So just to give you a summary of both the policies. So the Advanced Locality Management or ALM started as a resident initiative in 1997, which was later adopted by the municipal corporation. Basically, it meant that a group of residents would come together to form a collective called the ALM, which managed the collection and segregation of waste. And this mainly operated in formal housing or cooperative housing societies. And specifically in the year 2000, when the first waste management rules came into being and spoke about the necessity for collecting waste from slums, in the following year, the municipal corporation started the scheme called Dattakwasti Yojana, which was later modified and renamed as the Swachh Mumbai Prabodhan Abhiyan. And this basically operates in slum areas in a similar manner where community-based organizations are employed by the municipal corporation who have to again look at collection and segregation of waste in the locality assigned to them. So what I want to say is that both these operate as participatory policies within a largely centralized waste management system in the city of Mumbai. And therefore, we see that participation is really limited or confined to policy implementation and also to the lower valued processes of waste, such as collection and segregation, which rather support the higher valued or more profitable processes of waste recovery. And participation is mediated as designed by the policy by associations of ALM and CBO respectively. The major differences, as I mentioned, is that the area of operation in cooperative housing societies versus slums. Now, what this does is that it offers a differential in participation, which was offered by the government to the residents residing in cooperative housing societies versus slums, where the ALMs had much more autonomy. They had a participatory platform provided, whereas that was not the case for SMPA. Similarly, taking cue from what Radhika spoke about impurity, similar things are seen here in the sense that the ALMs, who are mainly middle-class associations, had an indirect relation to waste in the sense that they only had to monitor the collection and segregation of waste, which was otherwise done by waste worker collectives operating in the locality. Whereas under SMPA, the community-based organizations were actually supposed to employ volunteers from the community in the slum who would actually do the collection and segregation of waste. So their relation was much more direct. Now, what I'm going to do today is see how these differences operate, but at the same time, what I saw in my analysis is that in the implementation of both these policies, there were a lot of commonalities in the way in which the networks of participation operated. And that is what I see as a participation operating in Flux through three means. So the first thing is that basically what I see as the implementation of both ALM and SMPA, which took place through agency networks or collective agency of actors, both who were included in the scheme, such as the MCGM administration and the ALM or SMPA leaders, and those who were excluded or not considered as participatory actors, such as party workers or even elected representatives and private waste management companies and so on. So this quote here, the SMPA leader talks about how party workers were very crucial for garnering support in segregation awareness campaigns in the slum. So what we see is that in these networks basically moved beyond the participatory limits in terms of what both the policies identified as participatory actors. So they went much beyond that to also include other sets of factors which were crucial for implementation of waste management. And what is most interesting is that relations in this network operated through very interpersonal interactions, which were again based a lot on commonality of identities. So if an ALM leader and an MCGM administration belonged to the same region or had the same language and so on. So caste, religion, class acted as factors which would lead to good relations. And similarly, there was a spectrum of good to bad relations that my participants spoke about. Another interesting thing was a behavioral aspect of how respect in terms of interactions played a very important role. If actors considered that they were given respect in relations, then that was considered as a good relation. What we see is that because of this differential in habitus, there's also a lot of hierarchy that existed in the network and a lot of power differentials. So as seen from the quote here, the SMPA worker talks about how their opinion is not considered by anybody. So again, this is associated not only with issues of caste and religion, but also in terms of proximity to waste, where not just spaces that waste occupies, but also people who deal directly with waste are also characterized with a sense of exclusion. So what this brings to participation is a lot of subjectivity, in the sense that across the city, the policies were not implemented uniformly. Even in the same locality, there would be changes. And there was uncertainty in waste management. So if there were good relations, then it would be very easy to get, say, a permission for a compost pit. If there were bad relations, your complaints would not be solved, you would be excessively fined, and so on. So the third thing is temporariness. So what I see is that even in relations between participatory actors as well as over time, for example, this quote where the ALM leader talks about how the transfer of officers in the municipal corporation, the continuous transfer of officers meant that relations had to be continually built, rebuilt, broken, and so on. So this was one kind of flux operating in these networks. The second thing is of how these participatory actors basically moved beyond the limits of participation offered by the ALM and SMPA policies to kind of expand their geographies through basically these networks. So expansion of geography, for instance, as mentioned by the ALM leader, from one lane to more surrounding areas. Issue-based, not just looking at waste management, but several other civic issues, even criminal issues in the locality. Which also meant an expansion from just dealing with the SWM waste management department in the ward to also looking at various other actors like parastatals, the state government, even the police department, and so on. So these networks kind of expanded participation much beyond what was envisioned in the policy. So this quote talks about how the methods of participation also evolved. The CBO leader talks about how they collaborated with several other CBOs and they filed a court case where they demanded for better remuneration under the scheme for the waste workers. So through this, what I see is that the actors have, through their agency, moved beyond the participatory limits, such as demand making for policy change. And I see this through both associational and individual trajectories. So this SMP leader, for example, she started a women's self-help group in the locality, and she encouraged other women to do so. And first, she moved on to become a coordinator of the SMPA scheme within her locality, and then was also approached by a party leader, and now she's a party worker encouraging other women in her locality to join politics. So these kind of individual trajectories have been seen where agency plays a very crucial role. And also associational trajectories in the sense that, for example, this ALM started an NGO in slum areas. The third thing is basically more structural, of how these networks have changed over time because of change in policies. So mainly international kind of goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals and more national policies such as Swachh Bharat Mission and the revised solid waste management rules which came in 2016 kind of led to a change or shift in a more target-oriented approach towards waste management, specifically in the recovery sector. Which kind of increased the privatization and contractualization in both these schemes. And at the local level, what this did to participation is increase the precarity of these participatory organizations. For example, after the waste management rules in 2016, the responsibility of waste management shifted from the ALM to the Cooperative Housing Society, which now directly interacted with the municipal corporation and also with the mushrooming private waste management companies, marginalizing the ALM's influence in the network. Similarly, in SMPA, initially one community-based organization could be in a locality for 3 to 4 years, whereas now this was like reduced to 6 months, which broke the relations between the CBO and the residents and the CBO and the waste workers. However, what we see is that certain actors kind of navigated this to stay relevant. So as you can see here, ALMs now acted as mediators between the residents and the municipal corporation, whereas there were in CBOs we see an increasing relevance of political affiliation to stay put in the locality for more than 6 months. So this is just a kind of overview of simple overview of how these networks operated. In ALM, basically this is for the ALM. In red are what were the initial relations. In green are the extended relations, and blue are the changes that take place after the policy changes have taken place. So what I see is that basically there's a flux operating in terms of how participation is implemented through the ALM and SMPA. And the major takeaways for this are that we cannot see participation really as operating in binaries of citizen and government, but much more dynamic networks of continuous building, breaking, rebuilding, altering of relations, which are influenced by identities of actors, and therefore the individual in the network is very important. What I also see is how participatory policies offer an opportunity for expansion in participation at the urban local governance level, much beyond what was envisioned in the scheme. However, still there is an influence of the differentiated policy structure. For example, ALMs, after the change in policies, moved out of waste management. Whereas because of the direct association of waste that the CBOs had, they continued to stay in the waste management sector while also expanding their revenues to other issues. Finally, I just want to talk about how what this talks about participation is that there are exclusive participatory spaces operating. We all talk about representativeness and inclusiveness in participation, but what I really see is how there's an exclusive participatory spaces operating. Why this is beneficial in one sense is that actors are really focused on particular groups and particular localities, and they raise issues that are specific to those. There are no uniform kind of rules. However, what this also means is that there is a lack of collaboration, for instance, between the ALMs and the community-based organizations, between the two schemes, and that actors finally only operate for gaining better influence and power within their own networks, rather than looking at a city-wide approach, say, towards better waste management. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So Jennifer, just the question I want to park for you is to, given the theme of the panel, I want us to think that, the 2000s were full of long debates on participation. It was like the paradigmatic concept of a decade. It was meant to solve all kinds of inequalities and hierarchies. And one of the debates that happened at that time was how you understood if participation had succeeded or failed. And what I find really interesting about your presentation is when I'm looking at it and you see your first slide about how there were inequities in the participation process, and your second slide saying, but there were all these expansions and people started inventing these new spaces. Right. So when you look at it, the question is, if we take out waste management, did participation succeed as a political space if delinked from specific programmatic outcomes? If you stop seeing it as a mode to deliver X or Y? Because you spoke about urban local governance, right? And one of our big challenges in urban India is what we say, a very weak urban local government, right? So is, at the end of it, your two flowcharts with the colors, is that what we now think of an urban local governance system? Not the ward and the municipality necessarily, but these networks that are being created unintentionally. So just thoughtfully, did your participation succeed or fail? And if it did, what did it succeed at? And what did it fail as, right? So thanks so much for your contribution. Sure, all right, we return back to Zoom. And Sumedha, do we have you online? I heard your connection was a bit tenuous.
I'm here, yes.
Perfect. So then we will go now to Sumedha Chakravarthy from the University of Oxford.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Has it come through?
Yes, it has.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking about urban politics in Delhi and forms of participation. My presentation today draws on fieldwork I did as part of my MSc in Modern South Asian Studies at Oxford. I spent about 2 months doing fieldwork in Delhi, talking to people who self-identified as volunteers with the Aam Aadmi Party. My primary question comes from the fact that, megacities like Delhi are incredibly unequal, aggressively policed, and yet overwhelmingly, as we all know, the site of sort of various forms of mobilities and opportunities. And the question I sort of started out with is, what does participatory politics look like in such a fraught landscape? Previous work and also my sort of interests led me to considering the particular relationship that the Aam Aadmi Party has cultivated discursively, but also, again, symbolically in various different ways with the city of Delhi. The city has been a site of sort of continuous political success for them, and has also sort of, and continuously features again in Aam Aadmi Party campaigns elsewhere. And there's also a continuous sustained projection of a certain kind of intimate relationship with the city that really piqued my interest. And when I started asking the question of what does it mean to be a volunteer with the AAP? And so just quickly to set up sort of how I'm going to go about the presentation, it's in two parts. The first part looks at what I'm sort of broadly terming questions of effective citizenship and brokerage. And then the second part looks more closely at what sort of intimately volunteers seem to gain from participating with the AAP in this voluntary capacity. And to briefly also clarify two things. One, as I said, the Aam Aadmi Party has cultivated a specific relationship, or projected at least a specific relationship with the city of Delhi. That makes it a particularly sort of interesting field site for the same reason. And also the party's kind of sustained anti-establishment rhetoric, something that they've retained over the last decade that they've been politically active, is always pitted in contrast to existing parties that are seen as having sort of traditional methods of recruiting workers and supporters. The Aam Aadmi Party continuously in sort of various forms of publicity also talks about how they're a volunteer-driven party, which is why this form of participation becomes interesting again, because the party sees them or sees volunteers as their kind of primary driving force. And the last thing I wanted to clarify was, when I say volunteer here, I mean all the categories that go into various forms of political participation, karyakarta, workers, so on and so forth, are not. There's no watertight. There are no watertight categories, but volunteer here I specifically use in terms of individuals who self-identified as working for the party free of cost, voluntarily, and sort of longer term rather than just one-off campaigns. And I will now move on to the first part of my presentation, which looks at the ideas of effective citizenship, brokerage, and the idea of the right to the city. When I started doing fieldwork, and before that as someone who lives in Delhi, a lot of what would come up when talking to people about the Aam Aadmi Party was the idea that their governance model had been really successful. They'd done well with schools, they'd done well with mohalla clinics, they'd brought about a sort of local level successful government in this very specific way that people seemed very taken with. And so I started asking people if that was the reason that they wanted to work with the party. Was that the only reason? Was it the successful nature of the party schemes that was drawing them to it? And what emerged through the conversations I had with people, I have classified into sort of three interconnected ideas. The first being something that Sharupa Roy defined as the idea of effective citizenship, which is the performance of sort of ordinary everyday tasks in a way that's expediting them, that's making them easier, making them more accessible, and therefore allowing individuals to produce a certain kind of effectiveness to their citizenship. And this is something that Aam Aadmi Party volunteers all talked about, where they talked about the ability they had now acquired as volunteers to expedite things. If someone had a complaint and came to an MLA office, if someone needed help with their electricity meter, with their water tariff, they were able to help those people out. And that became a kind of central thing that people will keep coming back to, saying that it allowed them to sort of activate and meaningfully use their position as a citizen. The second thing is the idea of brokerage. Here by brokerage, I mean, there's been a lot of recent work and very exciting work about the idea of sort of urban brokers and what they do for sort of urban ecologies, social ecologies. Specifically, what I mean here is the idea that that very often volunteers anchored their ability to perform, again, productive, effective citizenship within the idea of being mediators, of being individuals who could now broker between the party's government, and the city at large. And this is something I'll come back to when I go over the vignettes of ethnography that I have coming up. And my overall suggestion here is that both the idea of effective citizenship and brokerage, when seen together, produce among volunteers the idea that they are then able to exercise their right to the city. And here by right to the city, I'm drawing on the idea of David Harvey, where he says that the right to the city is essentially the right to change ourselves by changing the city. And this is something that I think came up across my field interviews. The first idea I talked about in terms of brokerage, in terms of effective citizenship, as was visible in this quote, one of the things that interviewees talked about a lot was the idea that self-discovery and political learning or weakening were made possible through volunteer work with the ARP. For instance, this is a quote from a volunteer called Pranay, a young, well-to-do 26-year-old, who described his time as a volunteer in specific registers of awareness and opening out and learning about the city, and that kind of really changing his ability to make sense of the city and be part of it. Another informant, Anil, who also, like Pranay, was a young man, albeit from a very different part of Delhi. He was from Kusumpur Pahari. He talked also about how growing up in Delhi and watching a certain kind of politics being performed, when he watched the Aam Aadmi Party's early years of politics, he had a kind of activist epiphany where he felt like finally there was a way not just to participate, but also to find a politics that resonated with him. And all of this, of course, is not to say, and I often run the risk of this with presenting my work, is not to sort of celebrate the Aam Aadmi's politics, the Aam Aadmi Party's politics uncomplicatedly, but to say that with all the people I was speaking to, there was a certain kind of resonance with what participation in this form was making possible that they all seem to sort of highlight to me. Even in this instance, Atul's imagination of volunteering is clearly informed by the idea of effective citizenship, wherein he could channel the efficacy of being a citizen by improving the city in sort of ordinary ways. For Atul, in the specific instance of Atul, that was to leverage his role as a long-time volunteer of the party to demand improved water supply to his neighborhood, demand a variety of different sort of urban municipal supplies to his neighborhood. Three other interviewees I spoke to also talked about how the sort of social capital volunteering was imbuing them with. Prerna, a young woman, told me about how people would, even after she'd stopped working for them when we spoke, she talked about how people would kind of reach out to her and she'd still be able to help them in certain ways. And that gave her a sense of belonging, a sense of being able to assert her right to the city. Similarly, Swati, also a young woman who moved to Delhi about 7 years ago, talked about being able to assert her right to be in the city, despite people sort of asking her why she was doing that. And all of this sort of anchored in the fact that working for the Aam Aadmi Party allowed them to volunteering for it rather, allowed them to demonstrate a certain kind of effective citizenship and perform mediatory role that was, expanding their right to the city. The last quote is one that I found particularly telling, where I was interviewing Mahesh, who's a shopkeeper in Southeast Delhi, and he told me that all the people who had mocked him earlier for being a volunteer with the party were now sort of turning around and paying their respects to him because he'd been able to demonstrate what effective citizenship would look like in his brokerage role as a volunteer. I now move on to my second part, which is the idea of how to make sense of the emotional and intimate aspects of the relationship between the Aam Aadmi Party and its volunteers, and what that means for these people who are sort of participating in the larger landscape of urban politics. As I've been sort of saying, a volunteer's effective citizenship, often by their own telling, was closely linked to their ability to get work done. At the same time, one of the other things that stood out to me was the fact that a lot of people repeatedly used terms of endearment, very kind of intimate registers in which to narrate their volunteering experience. And I'm using this kind of very sort of stock photo image of the autos with the stickers, also to signal that the party constantly capitalizes on this. They talk about love, they talk about, loving Delhi, being from Delhi, belonging to the city, and that in turn, Delhi loves them. And when I started doing field work, as I was talking to people, I met a lot of different people who had sort of very passionate responses to their time with the party as volunteers. But one thing that stood out to me was that people constantly talked about, they called it an emotional connection, as you can see in this quote, which is an interview with Kirpal, who is an auto driver at present and also does quite extensive volunteering work for the Aam Aadmi Party in his East Delhi constituency. And he sort of repeatedly used the term dil se when talking about the party, saying there was a connection felt from the heart, there was a kind of emotional connection. And this sort of using this vocabulary, I suggest, allowed him to bring together what was his kind of the experience of living in the city, but also not belonging to it entirely, not knowing how to make sense of that belonging, with a more sort of vocal, emotional register that was allowing him to assert that. Another person I spoke to, another informant, was Triveni, who also described the ways in which, once again, volunteering with the Aam Aadmi Party made it possible for her as a young woman to spend long hours out of the house, not just in terms of being able to do that socially or like having the mobility to do that, but also in the sense of that it allowed her kind of emotionally the space in which to navigate this. I'm running through a lot of this because I know the quotes are long, but I really didn't want to leave them out and wanted to make sure that people would be able to read at least some of them. And the idea here that I'm trying to sort of indicate is that when thinking about political participation, it's not just what it makes possible in terms of the mobilities in the capital, but also what it makes possible in terms of emotionally imagining yourself within the city and sort of having that broader landscape within which to situate yourself on a more kind of intimate level. Another young man I spoke to had come to Delhi as a student in 2011, 2012, and then he sort of became part of the party. And what he found as someone who had come here to study, to a master's degree and had moved here from UP was that volunteering for the party allowed him once again to create certain kinds of maps of the city, be able to move through it. And essentially what I'm saying is be able to imagine a belonging that was not just spatial, but also social and intimate and emotional. I think before I go to the conclusions, I just want to sort of emphasize that the idea here was then to look at this in two parts, to look at the social belonging through effective citizenship and brokerage, and to look at the kind of emotional imagined belonging through the idea of desire and love. To conclude, I definitely have some limitations in the presentation I've given here, but also in the paper. One is the paucity of informants. I interviewed over 25 Aam Aadmi Party volunteers during my fieldwork, but that certainly doesn't cover a large number of particularly minority identities that I think it's very key to look at and think about in terms of participation and participatory politics in the city. The Aam Aadmi Party's own very ambivalent, unstated ideological positions are important to interrogate and also to ask what their politics of convenience really means when thinking about participation and what kinds of participation are made possible. And lastly, I sort of wanted to re-emphasize what I was getting at, particularly in the second part of my presentation, which is that there is an essential sort of lyrical, emotional, intimate register to the idea of participation in the urban, which is already a site of sort of so much textured sort of imagination that I think it's important for us when talking about participation to also think about what it makes possible in these kind of personal, everyday, intimate ways. And I'll stop there because I think I'm just at time.
Thank you so much, Sumedha. It's really lovely to your work. So, Sumedha, the question I want to leave for you is to pick up the word that you used only in the 11-minute, 30-second right at the end, right? Which is the typical word for party politics, which is ideology. Okay? And so, there's a distinction between a volunteer and a member of a cadre. And Indian political parties have typically spoke of the cadre and not of the volunteer. So I want to just let you think a bit about what the distinction is between the subjectivity of the volunteer and the cadre. And to maybe say that, maybe to think a little bit more about the two particularities about the Aam Aadmi Party. One is that you're speaking to them in a moment where they transition from movement to party. And they are very much at this point still possibly the only urban party, right? Because the notion of brokerage, which is so locally urban in problem solving, it's also because your election is local. It's no longer an ideological election fought for the state, for example. And so just to reflect a bit on whether a notion of brokerage and problem solving can become enough of a political identification, precisely because this is one of the few places in India where really the elections are urban elections and not state elections. And what happens now as AAP scales out to becoming a national party and the questions of ideology begin to return instead of the questions of belief, participation, and problem solving. So just to think a little bit about that. But thanks very much for that. A really, really interesting presentation. And now I come back to Anasma Goyari from Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Thank you, Gautam. Good evening, everyone, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining online. What I'm going to present tonight is a working paper that constitutes a small part of my ongoing doctoral study on labor migrants from the northeastern states in Delhi NCR. So I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions. The title of my paper is South Korean Pop Culture and Northeastern Labor in Delhi's Urban Village, Identity and Subjectivity of Migrant Labor in Flux. Popular culture, as we commonly understand, is a terrain of ephemeral trend cycles, aesthetics, and cultural practices. However, as Stuart Hall, one of the pioneers of British cultural studies, argued, a cultural field is a field of relations which is always structured in dominance. Therefore, it is a terrain of everyday life where the dynamics of everyday politics of hegemony, dominance, and resistance comes into play. Therefore, concurrent with the theme of the conference, in this paper, I study the ongoing flux and tension in migrant identity and subjectivity in the global travels, production, consumption, and reproduction of the now ubiquitous South Korean pop culture wave known as Hallyu. Or the Korean cultural wave has taken over the entire globe, signaling, according to some observers, the Republic of Korea's ascendancy as a global soft power. The rising popularity of Korean pop culture across the world has been attributed to the proliferation of social media and over-the-top platforms, and South Korea's current leading position in digital technologies. Michelle Cho, a scholar of East Asian studies, correlates the popularity of Korean pop music, known as K-pop, to its cosmologic, that evokes discourses of globalization, world-making, and cosmopolitanism. Therefore, K-pop music is not ethnically or sonically marked, as it is derived from popular Euro-American genres like hip-hop, rap, jazz, and R&B, and also samples tunes and styles from regional music such as Hindustani music and Afro-Caribbean beats. Moreover, since its inception in the 1990s, K-pop has always been strategically promoted as an export product rather than for domestic consumption. The popularization of the K-pop music was followed by other commodities of South Korean cultural industry, such as K-dramas, which are Korean television web series, Korean webtoons, K-beauty, which is Korean skincare and cosmetics, Korean food, beverage, literature, and so on. In India, Hallyu had entered first through the northeastern states, particularly Nagaland, Mizoram, and Manipur in the 2000s. Particularly in Manipur, where Bollywood movies and Hindi television channels were banned by the Revolutionary People's Front as a resistance to Hindi cultural imperialism, Hallyu wood filled in the vacuum. The opening up of trade routes between India and Southeast Asian countries through the Northeast on account of India's lookist policy had facilitated the importation of electronic goods like CDs and DVDs, which were mostly pirated, of Korean dramas, music, albums, movies, and so on. Enter the other parts of the country a bit later. In 2012, in order to enhance the cultural relations between India and the Republic of Korea, a Korean cultural center was established in Lajpat Nagar of New Delhi, which works as an extension of and funded by the Embassy of the Republic of Korea. The cultural center, along with Korean corporate media houses, have been making efforts to disseminate and organize Korean cultural festivals and K-pop concerts across Indian cities. Most recently, Hallyu has also found its place in an urban village in South Delhi, Humayunpur, which is a focal site of my research. Humayunpur, people familiar with Delhi would know, a complex and messy patchwork of residential and commercial spaces, has witnessed the mushrooming of Korean restaurants, cafes, cosmetics, and other stores in and around its vicinities within past 5 to 10 years. Since the 1990s, this Jat-dominated village has rapidly transformed into a station for incoming working-class migrants, initially from states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Nepal, and since the 2000s from the northeastern states. While a shared sense of racial alienation and insecurity have pushed the migrants from the northeast, who now constitute the mass of service providers in Delhi's neoliberal service economy, to ghettoize themselves in the urban villages, the landlords prefer northeastern migrants as tenants due to the ability to extract higher rents from accommodation and small-scale businesses through racial intimidation. Therefore, over the years, Humayunpur has transformed into a prominent northeastern ghetto in Delhi. According to K-pop critiques, the most striking aspect of Korean pop culture is its visual appeal. K-pop songs are a type of total entertainment that includes choreography, fashion, makeup, style, and idol personality, all of which are packaged into visually stimulating pieces. Its music, fashion, style, and aesthetics have become popular among youths across culture, gender, and religion all over India today, from Kashmir Valley to Kerala. While Hallyu is said to have broken East Asian stereotypes and the hegemonic Western beauty standards, it nonetheless brought to a fore a modern, racialized, at most times ignorantly racist Oriental aesthetic. For instance, as you can see in this slide, the foxy eye trend that emulates and almost mocks the stereotypical Asian slanted eye, and the very problematic glass skin trend that glamorizes fairness and poreless translucent skin. In Humayunpur, the Korean businesses are owned either by Korean nationals, quote-unquote Indian mainlanders, and even northeastern migrants, but they all employ a worker from the northeastern states of India and occasionally from Nepal. As sociologist Eileen Otis argues, in a consumer economy, the body is used as an index for ethical commitments, a sign of aspirations for class membership, and a vehicle of consumption as part of labor discipline. The twin processes of liberalization and urbanization of Delhi to transform it into a world-class metropolis has fueled a status-driven upper-class and middle-class consumerism. Consumer spaces like shopping malls, hotels, upmarket cafes, according to Veronique Dupont, promotes the foreign as superior to the domestic, and in turn reflects and creates aspirations of success as being embedded in global identities. In this neoliberal consumer culture, therefore, it is the racialized laboring youth from the Northeast whose bodies came to be marked by a consumption-driven aesthetic of global popular culture. The racialized migrants from the region whose faces and physical aesthetic do not figure in the hegemonic imagination of an Indian face are absorbed by these industries as service providers. Their sartorial choices are considered to be Western or Korean, and the disposition and demeanor suitable for professional soft skill training. Another study of a different pop culture scene in Delhi also talks about a similar racialized division of labor. Urban anthropologist Ethiraj Gabriel Dattatreyan, in his book The Globally Familiar Digital Hip-Hop Masculinity and Urban Space in Delhi, writes about how in the Delhi's hip-hop and club scene, racialized and gendered youth from the Northeast, as well as Nepal, are often put in visually prominent and interactive positions such as party promoters, DJs, and dancers, while the club bouncers are invariably Jat and Gujjar men. Similarly, in my study, while the front desk service workers of these Korean businesses come from northeastern states, the platform delivery workers are from eastern states like Bihar, West Bengal, and Uttar Pradesh, strongly suggesting a practice of racialization in the urban service economy. While the otherness is valorized in the capital cities' effective service industries, outside the spaces of commodification, their otherness is effectively maintained through social discrimination and violence. Their misrecognition as racial others make them susceptible to socioeconomic, gendered, and cultural discrimination on an everyday basis. During the COVID-19 pandemic in the USA, Asian diasporic people with stereotypical Mongoloid features became subjected to racial violence, especially after former US President Donald Trump called the virus as Chinese virus and Kung flu. The incidents paralleled in India, where racial discriminations against Northeast migrants were on the rise merely because of their perceived racial proximity with the Chinese people. Racial discrimination against Mongoloid-looking people in India took place in public places and educational institutions across various states from Delhi, West Bengal to Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. Apart from being verbally abused as Corona or Chinese, migrants were spat on, denied entry into basic facilities and public places, evicted or threatened to be evicted from accommodation. It is one of the most influential South Korean boy band in the world, BTS, also known as Bangtan Boys, who were invited by US President Joe Biden to speak at the White House against anti-Asian hate crimes in America. While Northeast migrants have found spaces for cohabitation and work in the urban villages, their physical and economic mobility and their access to the city are tightly restricted within these spaces. The local customs and mores of these villages continually put their civility, morality, and even nationality into question. They're involved in daily politics with the landlords who quote inexorably high rent prices, morally police their food habits and dressing style, and conduct a surveillance of their lifestyle. The apparent Korean or Western orientation of their clothes and fashion become pretexts of deducing racist perceptions about their sexuality and morality. A controversial 2005 pamphlet released by the Delhi police reportedly had sexist injunctions pertaining to the clothing of Northeastern women. They were advised not to wear revealing dresses, to avoid lonely road or byland when dressed scantily, and to dress according to the sensitivity of the local populace. The reason why I am more fascinated by Korean pop culture than other prominent pop culture and subcultures is because K-pop or Korean pop culture constitutes a significant part of their identity as migrants in the global racial order. As scholars of cultural studies argue, pop culture is, after all, a terrain where a sense of identity, distinctiveness, relative autonomy, and commitment to ad hoc communities are formed. In a study conducted in Manipur in 2013, scholar Remengam Marchang found that youth across socioeconomic backgrounds and genders were accultured to Korean culture, he argued. Had there been no physical similarities between Korea and the tribals of Northeast India, the wave may not have had much impact to attract customers in Northeast. Datta Trayan similarly observed in his own field of hip-hop that even as they consumed American hip-hop, Northeast and Nepali youth gravitated to Korean hip-hop for fashion cues due to racial resonance. This kind of self-identification and self-fashioning based on racial resonance is in tandem with the kind of emergent racial solidarity among migrants in Delhi that cuts across borders and ethnicities. Scholars have called it an emergent pan-Northeastern identity, which was non-existent before the 2000s, before the out-migration, as it does not evoke any collective memory or homogeneous consciousness. Yet, this label, which originates in the cities, defies geopolitical and cultural confines by embracing people with similar physiognomy and experiences of racism from outside the Northeast, such as migrants from Darjeeling Hills district of West Bengal, Ladakh, Nepal, Tibet, and Burma. In the subaltern practice of solidarity and self-identification, otherness is therefore transformed into a productive site of distinction that creates new social and economic possibilities for the migrants. Migrants utilize this un-Indian trope to make way into service industries as racialized labor, or by setting up their own Korean cafes, restaurants, and shops in the urban village. Nonetheless, this form of self-identification with Korean culture is based on consumer, or rather prosumer practices characteristic of the Web 2.0 that is complicit with the exploitative dimensions of global capital. Okay, so I think I'm done. I'll stop there. Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anasma. So very briefly, I wanted to actually ask you something that you began to get into right in that last paragraph, which was this idea of wielding a non-Indian K-pop identity as a way to, this idea of using it as a way to reconfigure this racial recognition, right? And you're rightly sort of saying this idea that it allows a pan-Northeast identity delinked from collective memory. So one of the notions about culture that travels is very much that it allows a certain recognition that is not already trapped in local meaning, right? So you get to take something that is global, K-pop, and then root it back in a way to mediate what's happening in Humayunpur, but also in Manipur. But so I just wanted to actually hear a little bit more about the practices of this reconfiguration, right? So what does it look like to be able to change the language in which sort of, the quote-unquote Northeast appears in the mainland and appears in Delhi, and then re-navigate it through K-pop, this kind of collectivization. And you're warning us of the fact that it's still caught up in this consumption. Korea still created this culture to export it. It's not like Korean culture has moved, right? There's the intent. So I just wondered, when you think about what you described as Korea intentionally exporting this notion called Korean culture and Korean pop, in that way, what kind of pause does that give us? You're sort of signaling to us this is consumption-rooted, it's linked with this global racial recognition, but locally it has this possibility of unsettling and newness. So how does one think about this friction between global echoes of a racial Orientalist imagination, but local possibilities that allow you to undo something that you're caught in? So really, really nice, provocative work. Thanks so much for that. All right, and to close us out, we have Ishan Shahi from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay.
Thank you. So I'll just quickly set up the context of my work before context of the present. I'll set up the context of the presentation before proceeding. So the current presentation is a part of the second chapter of my PhD. So I'm looking in my PhD at three processes. So the processes of worlding, which are in place in the city of Banaras, through the smart city plan, the introduction of a cruise, then the promotion and propagation of spectacular practices of tourism, also which also converge into the larger processes of worlding at a later stage, and then monumental construction, specifically the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, which involved significant amount of displacement. All of these three I am bracketing within the categorization that at the end of the previous millennium, Satish Deshpande put as hegemonic spatial strategies of Hindutva. So, what I'm looking at are the production of space in the city. I'm using the framework of Lefebvre to look at how spatial practices, representation of spaces, and spaces of representation, or perceived, conceived, and lived spaces interact with each other to produce changes in the space of the city. So and the other notion that I found very interesting in Lefebvre's work was that of the monument as a built structure which embodies the collective will to power. And there is a long history of monumental construction and destruction and reconstruction in the city of Banaras. Madhuri Desai traces it specifically to the construction on its riverfronts and outside of its riverfronts in the 17th and 18th century, which also worked to solidify its identity as a Hindu city. Of course, the last point I've already touched upon. Okay. Yeah, so I am looking at the practices of a certain kind of tourist changes. So the kind of changes that have come across in the local practices in the city, specifically catering to the gaze of a particular tourist, and the kind of tourist over time has changed. With more recent years, a certain, a more richer kind of tourist is being catered to. So the spatial transformation has altered. It's not that there wasn't a tourist economy earlier, but the kind of tourist who's being catered to is changing and changing rapidly. Worlding practices significantly, so specifically that the worlding practices I'm referring to, the Smart City Plan document and the proposal makes direct references to Vatican, for example, and other world-class location and specific practices that I'm going to point out to. So like the Ganga Aarti is specifically chosen to be promoted by the local administration, which is very different kind of support than the logistical support the state provides to other ritual practices. So yes, then there is the convergence between the transformation of the city and its riverfront under the tourist gaze and the practices of worlding instituted in the city through initiatives like the Smart Cities Mission. So the Ganga Aarti begins in Banaras in the mid-1990s, specifically 1995 on the Dashwamedh Ghat by the Gangotri Seva Nidhi. I won't go into the specifics, but then the single Aarti splits into 3 and then becomes 1. But it also, while there were a lot of allegations about the Aarti as a trick to ensure that the stay to Banaras becomes a 2-day stay, because to attend the Aarti you'll have to stay overnight, the local people. Or instead of working on the purification of tributaries in Banaras, which fed into the Ganga, or the cleanliness of Ganga, to just make do with praying to the Ganga. But both of these allegations do not explain the success of the Ganga Aarti in becoming not just an iconic practice within the city, but also an iconic image which represents as a metonym the city in popular media. The reason for that, which which made sense to me, was the specific engagement with the tradition of bhakti poetry, specifically the works of Tulsidas. Of course, that also excludes other bhakti poets of Banaras like Raidas, like Kabir, who come from a more egalitarian tradition. But bhakti poetry Sagun Bhakti poetry, for that example, becomes is performance of that devotional poetry, and it also the performance is very theatrical in the way for someone who attends it. Of course, to brand and promote it, poor Shinzo Abe and Emmanuel Macron were also dragged into it. I don't know if they enjoyed it, but that did promote the Aarti within the country and in the city, obviously. Now, on the Dashashwamedh Ghat, it happens all very orderly. That's where they were taken. On another end of the city, on the Asti Ghat, where these Aarti also happen, because these are the two ghats which are motor accessible by cars and bikes. So there a very different and messy scenario emerges, because there are three Aarti committees which do their own Aarti and do not get along with each other. So they use their loudspeakers to out-blare the other in complete lack of synchrony. So, and then there is the Dev Deepavali, which is another practice of recent origin, but it is assumed to, through time, been associated deeply with the city. So what began specifically on the Panchganga Ghat has expanded throughout the western built ghats. Also on the eastern bank of the river, which is just sand. Now the administration comes along and sets up fireworks, also arranges for tenders for cleanliness, for setting up diyas and festivities. So there is the two kinds of things that are happening. So at the level of the state, there is a promotion which is logistical, and then proper endorsement, and so logistical support and endorsement and promotion are two tactics. So at this time, it also shapes the city's tourist cycle. So boat rides which usually fetch 500 rupees can easily fetch 20 to 30,000 rupees. On the night of the Dev Deepavali, all hotels get booked. So that does happen. Self-confessedly, a lot of boatmen have told me we easily make 5 to 6 lakhs in a night. So now the emergence of riverfront palace hotels. So there is the Brij Rama Palace, which is owned by the Clarks Group, and then the Guleria Kotri by Jukasa Group, Delhi-based hoteliers. So they cater to extremely rich clients. To put in a number, the Guleria Kotri has a nightly tariff of 17,000 rupees, and the Brij Rama Palace 32,000 rupees. So they are act as enclaves of performance of class distinction within an otherwise shared pursuit of religious good or merit. They also point to the transformation of Banaras into a tourist destination, and an instance of monumental appropriation of built structures by hotel groups and a class of very rich tourists. Also these hotels also differ from other luxury hotels in the cities, which are situated closer to administrative institutions which were established during the British rule. So the other hotels, luxury hotels of the city, are closer to the DM's house, to the court, to the cantonment. So yes, and then there is the question of older pilgrimage practice, the Panchkoshi Yatra, which is an 80-kilometer long pilgrimage done over 5 days, traditionally done over 5 days, and also marks the sacred boundaries of the city, but is finding it difficult to get the same kind of attention, either from the devotees, in the imagination of the devotees, and from the state support. And it also needs a very different kind of state support, because it needs investment of building in dharmshalas for pilgrims to stay overnight. The Antargrihi Yatra has also receded in popularity. And what it has also led, interestingly, is that many shrines that were very crucial to the performance of the yatra and had an important place, were demolished and or dislocated during the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, and a religious authority of the city, the Vyasji and Vyas Bhavan, were both demolished. Vyas Bhavan, also for those interested, was also the legal party in the battle between the Gyanvapi Mosque and Kashi Vishwanath temple. So I think I have gone over these points more or less. Yeah, also the last point is that these newer practices, which are highly visible, in a way spectacular. I mean, if I wasn't aware of Professor Robinson's work, I would have called them neoliberal, but so they are also more suitable in identifying the city with Hinduism of a specific kind and with the leadership of Narendra Modi. And also they are cheaper to organize and do not require significant capital investment on the part of the district administration. So yes, urban form of Banaras bears deep relationships with practices of pilgrimage, as seen with the Panchkoshi Yatra. The control over the production of spaces by the state is pursued not just through planning conceived spaces or representation of space, but also through support and endorsement of particular set of ritual practices, perceived space and spatial practices. This shows how each end of the dialectic of spatial production enters into or interacts with the other at one level while still maintaining its distinctiveness at a certain other one. The favors extended to practices suited for tourist gaze by the state, with different ritual practices of same religious affiliation in competition. These practices then compete both for resources, state and imagination and beauty. And worlding practices in Banaras are not limited to tourist services like the cruise and the smart city mission, but also showcasing of ritual practices as events, events of cultural symbolic consumption. These developments imprint the monumental intent of the BJP on the city of Kolkata.
All right then. All right. First, 1 point for Jenny to reduce neoliberalism invocations by n equal 1, for which we will be grateful. And Ishan, thanks a lot for that. You know, I think your argument is very clear to us about the kind of the work that the monumentality is doing. But I wanted to actually give you a tangential question, which is to say that not just tourist cities, all cities sell imaginations of themselves, right? And so if I think about the way Bangalore, where we are, has tried to tell a story of itself as an information technology city, right? And if you think about the monumentality of the Karnataka Digital Investment Hub, if you think about the fact that even though less than 10% of Bangalore works in IT, anyone you ask about IT thinks everyone here works in IT. And the way IT was used to displace garments as the dominant logic of the city's economy and employment. So I want us to just think a little bit about what happens to the idea of monumentality when it moves just from tourism and heritage, but becomes an ordinary practice of urban development, right? An idea of image making, an idea of worlding. Because while I definitely see in some ways, I'm thinking also of the paper earlier today about Bodh Gaya, which has a very similar possibility, but a completely different outcome in the way it tells the story of itself as heritage. So just to think a little bit about the counter argument to what you're saying, which is, what if this is not monumental, but actually quite ordinary, but roots itself in Banaras in a particular kind of way, just to think through. All right, thank you all to all our speakers. I'm going to open the floor. If we could have the chat Q&A questions up on the screen, and I'll alternate. And I'm going to take 3 questions at a time and ask folks to take notes, and then go one round where you respond to everything once to close, okay? So folks, floor open. I see one hand in the front here. If we could get a mic. And if I could see the Q&A box, I'll just alternate between them. Rohit, start.
Great. Thanks. I think this was one of my favorite panels of the conference. So yeah, my question is like for Jennifer. So I loved, and it kind of builds on what the question which Gautam also posed you. If we remove the subject of the focus and how that network, the whole chart you showed, the extended relations, how that looks. So one of my what I'm keen to understand is what is the glue that holds that, according to you, according to your understanding, what is that glue that holds that dynamic network together? Because within that network, even if we remove the specificity, if that's the new normal, but within those also a lot of people are not permanent, they keep shifting. So the networks will also keep shifting. That same line will not be there anymore if that person does not want to interact with the higher up. So is that a permanence, or it is a temporal sort of a network, and it will keep evolving the moment one piece of that puzzle gets replaced by someone who is more powerful than the other?
Take one here and one way at the back.
Thank you for all those presentations. They're really interesting. My question was to Sumedha. I just wonder about I really like the category of effective citizenship that you were talking about. And if I understand it, you're thinking of it sort of in terms of practical, logistical, public service delivery forms of citizenship. And I'm wondering how that category, both sort of conceptually, but also in the lives of your informants, sits alongside the other conventional sort of juridical version of citizenship that we understand it. And I'm particularly interested because, of course, the ARP has a particularly ambiguous relationship with this question, and because it seems like your fieldwork period was very, very close to the NRC CAA protest. So I'm interested in how those might have played out in the field.
At the back. I can, but Zoom won't be able to. Can we get him another mic, please? All right, just 1 second.
Hi, extremely interesting panel. Congratulations to all the speakers. I had just one question which kind of speaks to both Radhika and Sumedha's work. So maybe we can kind of go with that. With respect to Sumedha's presentation, it was interesting to see a very well put together PPT in a conference. It was very lyrical in your own words, good pictures and everything. And in your own conclusions, you said that you had a very limited informant pool. I think let's be kind to each other, because every research has a limited informant pool. But what I would really like to know is more than the number of people, who were these people that you kind of spoke to? Because otherwise it seems like a slice of life of anecdotes of this moment you were in, which has research values of its own. But a lot of this was people we met. So which religion were they? Which caste were they? Delhi has been a city with a long history of Bahujan mobilization, Muslim mobilization, right? So how would that kind of intersect? As somebody who's worked closely with the movement as a volunteer or a person, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And with Radhika, something very similar, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you ended by saying that slums see other slums as sort of impure and don't want to see themselves as that. The idea of impurity of a slum is a very upper caste construct, and it has been advanced and imposed by them, and there's a lot of body of literature which speaks to that. So if these are your findings, it would be very interesting to know how, since your finding seems to formalize this, that the slums themselves see themselves as that, it would be very interesting because it is contestable. So again, who did you speak to? How many people did you speak to? What was the context of that interaction? And this idea that slum dwellers, it almost suggested that upper caste or elite people in the city have the luxury to distance themselves from the slums, but slum dwellers don't. And it almost seemed like we are essentializing that as a luxury. That to me felt a little uneasy, but that's my point. Maybe some comments on it. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I'll take a last question from here in the front.
Hello. My question is for Anasma, and you talked about K-pop, and that was an enlightening presentation, so thank you. And I've seen similar processes occur with the Japanese culture, with J-pop and anime. And so I can see the commodification of these cultures being kind of a way for Asian cultures to claim a space for themselves in global media. and kind of claim that representation. But in the process, they get stuck in this vicious cycle of Orientalism and racism. So my question to you would be, like, what would you think would be some of the ways to break the cycle, maybe locally in India or like more generally?
Perfect. So folks, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to hold that because otherwise I want to give all the panelists a chance to respond. You have my question, you have other questions from the field. Jennifer, would you like to start?
So just to answer your question, so I think you asked about how if one or more actors move out, what happens. So basically, of course, the network is, there is a temporariness in the way in which the network operates. And while certain individuals, it's also hierarchy. So in the sense that, for example, if a waste worker gets replaced, that is much more dispensable to the network rather than an ALM leader. So if an ALM leader or an SMP leader falls back, it means like the ALM is no longer operational. So those kind of hierarchies did exist. And specifically, I think this also relates to the way in which the municipal corporation operates. And since if we look at participation in the context of interaction of government representatives with more so, I don't know whether I can say non-government, but yeah, citizen actors, what we see is that there was a need for continuous building and breaking of relations because of transfer of officers. That was like the most prominent feature within the network that took place. And talking about the glue, I think there were two things. One is that a very important role was played by emotions, in one sense, on how individuals were treated when they had a first interaction, say, at a common meeting, or whether they were heard, whether they were offered chai. So in those kind of understandings, very simplistic behavioral understandings in interpersonal relations of how people were treated, kind of set the base for the relations. And then the second layer you had of more like commonality of identities, which also operated in terms of having good or bad relations. And to answer what you spoke about, whether it's successful or not, so I think it's great that the expansion of participation has taken place through these two policies, which were otherwise very focused on implementation of waste management. But what is also interesting is that these are also shaped a lot by identities. So, for example, when I spoke of the geographical expansion of ALMs, they expanded in geography from a particular lane to a locality, but that did not include the slum areas in the locality. They still only included cooperative housing societies. And similar things like the waste workers within the SMPA network had their own kind of organizations which interacted with the municipal corporation, advocated with them. So as far as context is concerned, just to summarize in 1 minute, I think the context in which participation operates is very important, be it waste or be it anything else. I think there were very intertwined relations in terms of how people perceived waste as a valuable product and as an excluded or a dirty product, and how that shaped relations of participation. So I think that was very crucial to the network. And the last part about the elected representatives of the network as the boundary. So I think that these networks, although they seem to be expanding, they were still very locally embedded.
Got it.
So yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask folks to hold yourself for a couple of minutes. Sumedha, can I come to you?
Thank you. Shall I work my way back? So I'll start with the last question and go to the one you asked quickly. It's so nice to be asked a question about who were your informants. It's like one of my favorite things to talk about in fieldwork. But very quickly, yes, absolutely. My informant pool, when I said limited, I just didn't just mean in terms of numbers, but it's definitely skewed in terms of the numbers of people I was able to access who had various forms of privilege, and particularly in terms of caste and religious identities. Some of my informants, several of my informants, some of whom I didn't finally include in this presentation or in my final thesis, but were Bahujan activists who had sort of worked with the party for a few years and had increasingly found that there was very little space being accorded to any concerns that they were raising or any forms of representation. And even in terms of giving out tickets, one of the things that a lot of people did talk to me about was this growing, what they sort of many people labeled was this undemocratic ticket giving, where they were like, they're not giving out tickets in the ways that we thought they were going to, or they did originally. So absolutely, that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of religious identity, I actually had no formal informants who belonged to religious minorities. They were all sort of, and also in terms of gender as well, that was actually one of the things that I was kind of trying to pry out from my work, from when I was looking over the interviews. I have a quote from an informant who said, and he said it in Hindi, he said, Aam Aadmi Party Londo ki party hai, which is essentially that the Aam Aadmi Party is a party of, I guess, young men is the closest translation to Londa. I think that was one of the big things that I struggled with. And as someone who's kind of hoping to build on this more expansively, I definitely would like to build a sort of field where my informants are drawing from as many. And it would be possible in a city like Delhi, particularly, I think, given the way that the app works, for there to be absolutely no volunteers or very few volunteers. Yes, it's likely that they're sort of structurally marginalized within the party. That is possible. And that's probably likely given some of the things I've heard, but it is definitely something that my work at present doesn't have enough of at all. So that's one. The second question was about how the idea of effective citizenship sits along the idea of sort of citizenship as legal convention. To clarify, my fieldwork was in the spring of 2022. So it was almost 2 years after the pandemic hit and protests had to sort of move online and things. So I didn't hear so much from people directly in terms of addressing that. What I did get a lot of, because I was asking people that, was in terms of ideology, how, one of the things, again, I was told by someone in the party, not even just a volunteer, someone who formerly is in the party, was that they would reveal their ideology in 2024. And this was something that I put to a lot of my informants, asking, what do you feel about that? Do you know? And I think a lot of the things that people seem to say was that the ideological ambiguity allowed them to do what they wanted or make of it what they wanted. But I didn't have a clear answer in terms of what do you think about, I don't have a clear answer even in terms of juxtaposing these, but this is very helpful. Thank you, because I would love to kind of think this through more carefully. And lastly,
can I just hold you? I'll come back to you if I have time, but I'm conscious of 7:30. My apologies. Radhika?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So I'll just answer the last question. This is something I actually wanted to expand on. And so the literature that I was looking at, the question was about whether we're essentializing distancing ourselves in a city from the slums as a luxury. Some of the literature, when I was looking at it, I drew on environmental justice. And I also started looking at literature that was posing an alternative human-environment relationship, like Tim Ingold and De Cola and stuff. So they were looking at the relationship between the human and the environment through the perspective of the marginalized, as if there is one particular view of the marginalized in the entire world, and kind of suggesting that the Western world draw on this to sort of solve our current problem of the climate crisis, which I argue is another way of exoticizing, romanticizing marginalized ontologies and human-environment relationships. And when I was looking at the slum dwellers' relationship to their environment, this is what I was thinking about, that it's not that there is no romantic relationship between the water bodies and the slum dwellers, It is a relationship that they have problems with, that is disease, and it causes them issues, it's stinky. And it's not, they do want to distance themselves from it. When we talk about distancing ourselves from something that is unhygienic, it is unhygienic for everyone. It's not that, and that's something that they're not allowed to do. So that was one thing. And it bridges into their need to dissociate from other slums in these resettlement sites, for the reason of caste, which is because when you put people from different castes and different villages into one place, that breaks that sense of community with which they approach the city in the first place. when they come to the city, they're simultaneously both rural and urban in the sense that they keep their rural ties, which is how they come to the city, and that's their network. That's what helps them in the slums. So this is broken once you put into these resettlement sites, and they don't have that luxury of forming their community, even if it is, based on discrimination, when the others in the city are allowed to do that. My point was that it's not whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but that this is one way that you can see that they're at a disadvantage. They don't get to form that community through exclusion like other people in the city do. That was one. The second, so I was, the other questions are the ones that Gautam asked. So with regards to impurity, that's definitely a word I picked up from caste studies. And it's, especially while talking about water, there's so many accounts of how in rural India there is discriminatory access to water. And the notion of impurity is kind of at the heart of this discriminatory practice. And so that's where I drew on the word impurity. And I think the way I looked at it in practice in some of the sites that I studied, which is the resettlement sites, the eviction site, and the officials and other government officials and police and media, journalists and things like that. So impurity here was in the dynamics between some of the private development individuals in the peripheries and the resettlement site residents. The entrances into these places of employment for them were separate from the general, like the entrance into the gated community itself. And these were some of the ways that I was studying or like looking at impurity through the lens of caste studies. And illegality, I think, is interesting there in juxtaposition with impurity, because there's so much illegality in the way evictions happen itself. Because in the first place, the man who filed that case against them did not really go about it legally. He has powerful political connections and he was able to bend the law. And the fact that that they're not given that 30-day notice, none of this is done legally, really. So that is also illegal. But the way the illegality of the slum dwellers is read is kind of, the impurity is built into that illegality of their existence in that land. And I think that's how I can best answer that question.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Radhika. Ishan.
Well, the imagination of Banaras as a specific kind of a religious city, and what looks as, or what is shown to be monumental is not so monumental. So I'll just point to act that was passed in the year 2018. It was the Kashi Vishwanath Special Area Development Board Act. Sure. It designated 3 wards around the temple, beginning from Godalia, which is the closest market, and the motorable road to the Ghat, up to Chowk, which crosses the temple in areas like Lahori Tola. All of Lahori Tola is brought up, and designated a specific CEO of that board. The CEO was also the CEO of the temple trust, and gave them master planning authority independent of the city's master plan. What this allowed was the acquisition post willing of houses in the area of the corridor. Many times getting people to agree at a certain price, breaking their houses and giving them something else entirely. I mean, would an act like that in itself not announce a moment of monumentality?
Sure.
But it also allows other ordinary practices, changes them. Yeah. So here the ordinary and the monumental, I wouldn't say that which one is which, but they're both, at least the monumental in here is shaping the ordinary, and the ordinary will inevitably find a way back to speak to the act.
Sure.
So,
Thanks for that. Yeah. Nice.
very quickly. I think my response to you lies somewhere in your comments and questions that the migrant identity is always unsettling, or rather we can say it's always in flux, or migrant identity is mobile. Because this identification with a global culture, or the identification as a pan-Northeastern, as a Northeastern, also exists alongside other ethnic, tribal, or religious associations. And association to each of these levels of identity depends on their utility, depends on the socioeconomic setting. Suppose a migrant from the Northeast can easily enter a call industry by just saying that I'm from the North.
Right.
Or if in more intimate kind of setups like church groups, or when one is looking for financial aid, one can look to one's tribal brother or sister in that case. So that would be my quick response to you. And I don't think I have any answer to your question, or rather I have a very pessimistic response to that, because I think cultural industry, whether it's K-pop or J-pop or anime, it's the bank on racism and Orientalism. One of the first K-pop concert to be held was in the Northeast, because they knew that people in Northeast were really into K-pop because of this racial kind of resonance. And if you're aware of anime and other Japanese cultures and subcultures, they are invariably racist and Orientalist. So I don't know if there needs to be a break from the cycle. It's that my one radical and rhetorical answer will be to end to racism. Thank you.
And no more will be said after that. And that is going to be the closing note of the second day of the conference. Thank you all very much for joining us online as well as in the room here. We close today and reopen tomorrow's first session is at 11 a.m. The program is online as well. So wish you all a good end of day, good courage for your mobility journeys to wherever you're headed now, especially those of you in Bangalore. And we will see you tomorrow morning. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to the panelists, and a round of applause to close this out.
Just one logistical announcement. Those of you invited to the conference dinner, there's a shuttle outside to take us. So if you could just line up outside. Thank you.